Stefan, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It was very humbling and beyond what's required. But look, I must congratulate, along with Jill and Ebony, the Swiss Sports Physiotherapy Association. Your country's significantly less in population than Australia, but I don't think we could get this many sports physiotherapists together, and we are just so impressed of the work of your committee in bringing all of you together. But also, it just blows us away, your hospitality. We've met, re-met old friends and caught up, met very many new friends too, and Mario in particular has just been so wonderful to us. So thank you so much for the opportunity of being here today and sharing some of our work. So with no further ado, today we're going to talk about return to competition in tendinopathy. Now, 2 years ago, you had a conference on this very thing here, and a position paper came out of that with authored by Claire Ardern, and we worked with her in Melbourne. And it was covered an awful lot of scope, and way beyond any sort of scope that I would try and cover here today. So what I wanted to do was just sort of drill down to those areas that are of real importance to us, or real difference to us when we're talking about athletes with tendinopathy. We've alluded to some of this through Ebony's and Jill's talk so far, but then I'd like to sort of build on this and really look certainly at structuring this late phase rehab, and then into actually re-engaging back into sport, and then obviously some progression through there. A lot of that is about load management, as you know, and Claire and the consensus committee, and it was a very large committee, certainly made a very good point around that decision making should be shared. Now, this was very much in return to sport, but what we would say is that actually the whole management should be shared, and what we like to see is that the athlete understands the principles of tendon loading and pain, and how to modify training according to their pain, that the coach does the same. And so if we have everyone on board, it's a much easier process to go through than only feeding little bits to these the coach and athlete. In fact, over time, that we have so many coaches and athletes who can pretty much manage themselves. So that's our aspiration, and likewise, hopefully it's yours as well. So what I'd like to do today is actually just cover about 3 or 4 main areas. The first of which has been introduced, which is, understanding which parameters in tendon loading may be important to us. And as we've looked at that, and it's probably only in the last couple of years, it's really opened our eyes into perhaps there are other areas in which there's not a great deal of information that we should be considering far more deeply. We need a tool to be able to monitor the response of the tendon to loads. We tried way back in the 80s or 70s, assessing tendons, people with tendinopathy on King Coms and Cybexes, and it didn't tell us a blind thing. But we've got other tools now that we can use that probably, I think, give us much better indication of how that tendon is coping with the change in load. Then we'll cover a little bit on structured progression of these load parameters, a little bit on weekly planning, and lastly, just quite a bit on workload management, and I'm going to borrow quite a bit from other experts in the field there too. So, as I've alluded to, that tendinopathy really is a unique musculoskeletal injury. It's very unlike muscle. A lot of the tools that we've developed, for treatment of muscles really don't work for us in tendons, as I've said. It is different to bone, and it's fair to be said that there's a lot we don't understand in bone either. So, in fact, it really does set us back on our heels and realise that we've still got an awful lot to learn in this game. But the main thing is about knowing your sport and knowing different load parameters within your sport as they relate to tendons. So Jill and Ebony, Jill in particular, has talked about high tendon loads. So I want to really drill into that a little bit more about what we mean when we talk about high tendon loads. But here we're talking about the hopping, the jumping, the plyometrics, the landings in our jumping and landing sports. And because we know that these are the repeated activities that are the ones that really challenge people both to get tendinopathy, but also the challenge to return them back to these activities is the thing that we really struggle with. So what is important? Is it tensile load, that is how much force is going through the tendon, or is it the rate of application of that force? And I'm going to go into this in a bit more detail. It's certainly about volume, and we've talked for 20 or 20-something years still at least about quantifying the number of jumps, quantifying the number of landings, and I'll really build on that a little more. But the last element is something that was brought up in Claire Ardern's paper, which is about these open skills, if you like. So we've got closed skills and open skills, and I'll spend a little time on that. But here we're talking about change of direction and things that you're not doing in a very closed environment, but they're the real activities that are demanded of you in sport. You've seen this slide once or twice before, and I won't spend too much time of it, but it does really pull out the whole principle that we wanted to share with you. Ebony's gone through the fact that that the tensile load in the patella tendon, it was about 5 body weights or so that the tendon experiences, was pretty much the same across these 3 activities. But they differ enormously when we look at the rate of application of force to the tendon. This all happens very quickly in the tendon too, which I've got figures more accurate in the Achilles tendon. But landing from a jump, we see a rate of force application of about 36 body weights a second, and doing the stop or prop jump, which is actually the same as rushing a net in tennis, of about 80 or 90 body weights a second. So these are really significant, and it's this whole area that when this opened up to us, we thought, well, hang on, we didn't quite understand the magnitude and and what these forces actually mean. As Ebony said, and excuse me for repeating this message, but what it really does mean to us is that if we spend all our rehabilitation time in the gym and we're doing slow load-based stuff, and it can be really high, well, the same sort of tension loads through the tendon, but they really don't prepare us for the return to jumping and landing sports, and as we see other techniques within the Achilles too. So this really has changed the game for us, and this is something that one of the first things that we wanted to share with you. If we look at the Achilles tendon, it's a somewhat similar story that we see forces, which are in red, that vary from it's 3 or 4 body weights go through the Achilles tendon in just a calf raise, and it rises to about 10 body weights or so in really impulsive activities. But the big change obviously is in running, fast running and accelerations, as you see there, and I won't bore you with the numbers. But again, if we look at running at 7 metres a second or this, the peak acceleration that's being delivered to the tendon occurs in the first 50th of a second, right? It's incredibly quick. And so it really means that in our whole rehabilitation, we're preparing tissues to be able to resist some pretty extraordinary forces. And this is, as I've said, really changed our perspective on what we're trying to achieve in rehabilitation. As we've alluded to, load volume's important, but what in load volume? Is it the total amount of running? Or, as we're starting to think, it's really more about the total number of these high rate of loading events is probably the most important thing. That we could get a person with a patella tendinopathy to go out and they can go and run, 20 kilometres or so and actually not have too much in the way of patella tendon pain. But if we're asking them to do even 5 or 10 landings from a reasonable height, that'll be the thing that's provocative. So it is a matter of understanding your sport and the provocative elements within your sport that are contributing to whatever the tendinopathy is, being it Achilles, hamstring or whatever. And so we're coming back to better analysing our sport, sometimes with in collaboration with biomechanists or others as well, to try and pull together a story of what we're trying to prepare ourselves and return to. One of the big things then is, how do we quantify all these things? As happened for many years, we had people on a volleyball court, the couple of players who weren't playing, sitting up the top, marking the number of landings. well, that's pretty time intensive, but it was actually a really good investment for them because by controlling load, they actually reduced the number of tendinopathies they had. But now there are devices on the market, some have been successful and some not, and you really need to understand the limitations that make this more easy for us to be able to quantify. And of course, this is no different to what we see in football matches with people using GPS units to test accelerations for these higher types of loading on hamstring muscles or calf muscles or others as well. So these are all considerations for us. I alluded to open skills before, so obviously change of direction is quite different in terms of its demands on patellar tendon, where we're doing just a simple straightforward prop. That in change of direction we're loading up more the medial side of the patellar tendon or the lateral side. And these are things that we don't typically rehabilitate towards when we're doing everything in the gym. But ultimately these are things that people have got to prepare themselves for when they return to sport. So tendons are the same as muscles in that respect, that we do need to gradually introduce off-axis type activities and whatever's going to be accommodating or experiencing within their sports. Lastly, just one thing on the running itself. So cross-country running is quite different to flat-out track running, but one of the issues that we've commonly seen within our track runners, and this particular 400-metre runner, was running on inside lanes really does put a different load on the Achilles tendon, particularly the medial Achilles tendon, than any form of straight running does. So that if they are likely to come back to that sort of activity, graduating their loading from out in lane 8 to 6 to 4 to inside lanes if that's what they need to do. And of course this is important for all our middle distance runners. Our outcome measure. So what's our KINCOM? What's our whatever it is for the tendon? It's a very simple one and it's a lot cheaper. What it is actually it's two things. What we need is the amount of load and how the amount of load has changed. And as I've put to you, I think the important thing is most probably the rate of loading of the tendon. And then we've got this phenomenon which has actually been described all the way back in 1976 of the pain the next day, and which is more typically peaked the next day and tends to drop off in 48 to 72 hours. And this has actually been mirrored with work done by Sean Docking, where we can actually see subtle changes in the blue and green that Jill showed you earlier. So subtle changes in ground substance, which we see after high load sessions that peak at about 24 hours and drop off at 72 hours. So that our symptoms tend to more or less track along there, although that research hasn't actually been done yet. I caution you in your interpretation. But this phenomenon of pain that after high loads that are generally more the next day and taper off the day or two following is a very well recognised phenomenon, but it's something we can use. So I'll show you how. The other assessment tools that we have are things like the VISA, A, B, C, D, patellar tendon, Achilles tendon, glutes, hamstrings or whatever. Now these are great instruments and used in research, but they don't change a lot day to day or week to week. So I actually need other things that we're able to use that are actually more sensitive to short-term changes. And it's these load response tests, which are, as I say, are very simple little tests, but these are the things that really help us. And one of the things I will say, that if you are doing your hop test or drop test or decline squat test, that doing it at the same time of day seems to be very important to us. Not doing it first thing in the morning, because obviously those of you who've got Achilles problems know that your first couple of steps in the morning are not your best, and probably overestimates where we were truly at with that tendon, whereas doing it mid-morning or before your first set of isometrics or whatever is around the best time to be doing that. But pick a consistent time and do that. Our load response tests are as follows. Now, We have validated to a certain extent the decline squat test, which we use for patella tendons, but similar sorts of validations haven't been performed for those tests. But I don't think it should stop us using them, but it would be great for some master's student or whatever out there, and I can see you all, to maybe take on some simple things like this as a mean of helping, putting more bricks in our wall of understanding what we're trying to do in tendinopathy. So this is a slide that a number of you may well have seen before, particularly if you've been doing Jill's courses or Ebony's courses. But this is how we can use this, so that if we gradually increase the load over time, and we're doing this test of their decline squat test or their hop test the next day, 24 hours after that load, and the pain keeps creeping up and creeping up, then our tendon's really not coping with whatever load that we did last time and perhaps the time before too. So that's our immediate feedback. Whereas if for increasing load, if our pain's staying the same, so it might be 2 or 3 out of 10, it doesn't need to be 0. But if it stays at 3 out of 10 and our load's increasing, then we know that the tendon is starting to adapt to that load. And this is a great message to be able to take back to your patients. You know, they often come in and say, well, it still hurts, you know, I still get this much pain, so it's not getting any better. It's not getting any better. And I would say, well, hang on, a couple of weeks ago you couldn't do this, this or this, but now you can do this many landings or this many hops or this much running, and we've gone from here to here, your pain's still the same, but our function's improving, to use the language that we heard this morning. So this is a really important message to be able to take back to them. And as I often do, I've just stolen all my thunder, so there's that as well. So it's all about monitoring, and it is certainly about when we add these higher elastic type loads, that this is where we expect to see changes. So this is our very simple, very efficient, very cheap monitoring tool, that they go and do the loads. We need to quantify what the loads are, and we have got tools to then look at their pain afterwards. Simple, straightforward, and it's been tested on humans. So there you are. So planning tendon load. This is the crux of everything, that really what we're looking at doing is getting incremental load progression. We're looking to try and get the tendon load capacity up to what we need to do in the sport in terms of those parameters. We want to do, as I've alluded to, you know, this 2 or 3 day load cycle for the tendon to adapt to physiological changes in the tendon, but also pain guides that too. And so that when we get to high loads, introducing these 3 day load cycles are in fact a key element of how we plan our rehabilitation. And then just optimising workloads. So how do we implement this? Again, a slide you've seen before. So we're not about introducing new work. What we're trying to do is meld all these things together so it becomes, hopefully, an understandable story for you. So as Jill alluded to, it's about these small increments, and we'll look at these increments a bit later and what they look like, and how we're able to move from whatever tendon capacity we had at the time up to where we want to get to. So this is some work we did on, we had 3 national level 400 metre runners, and we got them to do a number of sort of activities that we might do in rehabilitation, and then relate that back to what they might be doing as they were going back to their running. And so we looked at these elements first, and so here we're looking at tendon force. You know, so that's the tensile force within the tendon. And so we've got down the bottom here, there's a seated calf raise where they had about 50% body weight added to the calf. A standing calf raise where they've got their own body weight, and we're able to push them up to about plus 50 or 60 kilograms. So that would explain some of the difference here, but they certainly had quite a bit of discomfort once you've got got a bar with 20, 30, 40 kilograms on your knee in a Smith machine performing this. So this was a bit of a challenge. A sled push, we did that in a controlled sense, so just pushing the tendon slowly, so each step is quite deliberate. Then a dynamic push where you're actually, it's similar to a sprint type start using the sled with some resistance. We did forward hopping, a maximum forward hop, which about 0.001% of the population can do. So your triple jumpers, it's basically the hop phase in a triple jump, and only track and field athletes can do this, and it's just one of those great things in athletics, and this is one of them. And then, of course, an acceleration. If we look at all the forces in the Achilles tendon, we can probably explain some of what's going on here, but there isn't an awful lot of difference here. But then on the next slide, if we look at the rate of force application to the tendon, happening generally within the first 50th of a second or so, there is a tremendous difference in the loads being applied to the tendon. So this can help start to inform our rehabilitation. We've got our slow gym work, and even the control sled push was slow. And then we want to add speed or add rate of force development. So how do we do that? Hopping looks like this, but if we got people to bunny hop, that is hop on two legs rather than one, we're going to end up with Achilles forces here. If we get them to do propulsive steps upstairs, and we haven't quantified some of these things. But of course, we've got all these incremental activities, limited only by your own imagination, of things between what you put in here as very slow activities and these very fast activities here. And these are really the sorts of principles that you might use in putting together your rehabilitation, particularly these last phases of rehabilitation, preparing you for sport. One of the things that we often get challenged with is how do we put it all together in a week? And so what I've given you is this slide, and yes, it'll be on Twitter in 2 minutes, won't it? Yes, but there we are. But this stage one, and Jill had the 4 stages, so I'm just going to use those 4 stages pretty much. So stage one, it's 4 daily sessions of isometrics, and it's 4 sets, and we all know that. So this is this isometric heavy, slow heavy load. Stage 2 is where we'll do a strength session on one day, followed by isometric, followed by strength. So the principle here is that we've got a day's recovery or 2 days recovery to the next strength session, which is optimal for our muscular adaptation. So many times in our rehabilitation, we've got to rebuild strength. And in fact, we really like to see the strength base before we move on to do these fast load applications to the tendon. These stages 3 and 4 are where we're adding these faster activities, and you've seen what those activities look like in terms of their rate of loading. So we can only do those every 3rd day. So we get a distribution like this. They might do their strength, followed by fast activities, fast elastic function activities, followed by isometrics to settle down this recovering tendon, and then we add a bit more load. They might be a little bit more in this session, and the same sort of thing recurs. So we're able to put that together right through to their return to competition. So that's the sort of structure that we tend to use, and it's only much later that you start to take out some of those days in the middle, because we really need this 3-day load cycle. Now, we thought we were pretty clever coming up with that until Sean and others were doing quite a bit of work on tendinopathy in horses. And guess what? The horse trainers worked this out 50 years ago, that they only gallop on them every 2 days a week or thereabouts, and they're the only other animal that get tendinopathy. So perhaps it's been tested on horses before it was tested on humans. So there you go. These are just a couple of examples. Again, snap away. I wasn't going to put them in, but I got browbeaten into putting them in. But this is just a concept of what things might look like. So we'll do a warm-up, and people will start with stride throughs. We much prefer with the Achilles to start with some running, which has got a start and an end. It might be 50 metres or 70 metres or 100 metres, and you'll progress that, and sort of 4 sets of 4 to 6 or 6 to 8 or whatever you choose. You know your sport. I'm not going to give you recipes, but much better than jogging. Jogging is not a lot less load on the tendon, and you don't get any breaks in between, and it really, people not uncommonly get fatigued, they lose form, and so we find this a much more controlled environment. And we can obviously increase the distance, increase the number of reps per session, etc. But only change one thing at a time: number of reps, or speed, or distance. And because you need to know what are the things that if it does come undone and your pain starts going up, we need to know what to go back to and what to modify. You know this. So we'll take people through to running, bounding, accelerations if they need to. But if they're a distance runner and all they've got to do is the first 2 steps for a 1,500 metre run and then off they go, we don't need to worry about that. And we actually had this very case leading into Rio last year. So it actually makes it a lot easier for you. And Jill showed us that, didn't she? That, you know, on the sliding scale, only get people ready for what they need to go back to. Because if you don't use it, you lose it anyway and you're back to where you started and you're just wasting an awful lot of rehabilitation time. I've talked about insight. I've talked about all of the rest. So there you are. There's Achilles. And again, because I was browbeaten into it, here are the jumping sports. So we talked before about how do you quantify jumping. So these vert devices are now pretty cheap. They'll pick up any landings beyond 20 centimetres of drop, and which is probably the more important ones for us, these higher loadings as opposed to lower ones. And so you can control the number of jumps, and then we go into jump stops and other things too. And then, as we've said, we've got all the rest here. And my goodness, I'm going to be, yes. I have one other area that I really want to spend some time on if I may be given leave to do. So how am I going, Stefan? Is that the 5 minutes or whatever? So this is the whole bit about optimising training workloads. This is a whole science in itself. We've got a great many very good people doing some work in this area, Tim Gabbett, Peter Blanche, Mick Drew and others. And so they will give us principles such as we need a training workload base to be able to then operate a training form. And if you're not prepared for your sport, then you're more likely to have higher risks. And we prepare for all elements of sport. The big thing is avoiding large weekly dips or large weekly increases in the amount of raining. You want to stay in the Goldilocks zone, and this is really what we're asking people to plan to do. We need to avoid big losses in continuity. Christmas holidays actually is a big issue for us. 4 weeks of no training, slothing around eating Christmas cake and other things, and then people want to go back to the same high tendon loads. As Jill said, we lose it very quickly. So keeping a couple of sessions going is very important, even with Christmas cake in your belly. And lastly, avoiding the boom bust. So a person trains hard, they've overshot their mark, they get injured, they have a rest, they've lost more conditioning, they go back, get injured again, and we get this boom bust sort of thing. And again, these are well documented within the literature. So here's one example, a person training really well. Their workload dropped off here and they had an illness where they lost a good couple of weeks. Returning from the illness, this is their chronic training load. This is their acute or 7-day average training load. This is the 28-day average training load. And what you see is their acute training load is over twice that, and that gives us an increased risk of injury. They actually didn't succumb to injury this time, but of course once they got into some fractured training and did a single big session where they went again over this training stress balance or relationship between your acute and chronic load, that's when they succumbed to injury. So this modelling is very useful to us. So what might we use? We might use something like the activities with these high loading rates, which might be things like jumping up or jumping on an inclined sled. And ultimately what we want to do is prepare ourselves for landings. Now, the rate of loading on landings is about 2 or 3 times that, so that to get a smooth transition between what we're doing in these breakdown activities and these here, we'll push the volume, the number of reps of these out from 6 sets of 6 to 6 sets of 8, but then because this is only about half the rate of loading of this, we can't go, an increase here. We actually have to drop these numbers back to get ready for it. Okay, so that sounds good, but how do we know all the loading rates? Well, we don't really, but we'll have a rule of thumb. But the thing we've got is that the tendons talk to us, don't they? So we've got our load response test that we're doing the day after that load, and is your pain staying the same? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? If it's getting worse, you've done too much here. If it's getting better or staying the same, we're coping. Yep. So that's how we put together our transition. And that's the thing that, notwithstanding I'm going, perhaps, am I over time or not? But that's the thing that I really wanted to share with you. There's another slide here, is that, you know, are we there yet? And this is the are we there yet slide. So that I've done exactly that transition in this modelling here from out of the gym, and this is our first jump load session here. If we followed the textbooks and only increased 10% a week, and we need to get a volleyballer back to 150 jumps a session 3 times a week, it takes about 23.5 weeks to get there. It's pretty tough on the athlete, pretty tough on the coach, and it's, you know, you probably won't get there. But what we have found, and this is in considered conversations with Paula Charlton and Mick Drew and other people who do this, that we can push these out a bit. This is our training stress balance here of 200, and we're down around 150 or 160. I've increased from this session 60% in my loading, then 50% in my loading, then 40%, then 30%, 20, 10, 10, 10. And we get pretty much within the safe zone and return to training within about 8 or so weeks, which is pretty much what we would do, and it's pretty much how it happened. So it's not all about guesswork, you know, that we can be considered in the way we plan. You're Swiss. You are the great planners, you know, you're the great attention to detail. And we think that these sorts of approaches, even though you don't know all the numbers, that we can use these principles, and our fail-safe is our load response test. And they're really the messages that I wanted to share with you. I've really said all this, and Jill has said that too. So my summary is, they're all the things I talked about. And so thank you very much. And just one thing, I know with the Australian Open coming up that you're all wishing that that's exactly what we see on TV. So thank you very much. Yep.